Welcome everyone to Après Midi. I am very, very happy to introduce Douglas Herbert, who is the, what is your title?
What is my title? I'm a commentator. It's simpler,
International
yeah.
Affairs commentator on France 24 in English. And today he's going to speak about the disinformation for dummies, Putin's propaganda war in Russia, Ukraine, and beyond. And let me just tell you a little bit about Mr. Herbert, who I have admired for so many years, and it took me a long time to make this connection, so I'm very pleased. And he's here for the second time in the last couple of years.
Yeah,
about 2 years ago, pre-pandemic,
yeah.
That's right.
Another life.
So Douglas Herbert is a New York-born, Paris-based TV commentator with France 24, who parlayed his early love for languages, literature, and travel into a journalism career that has taken him from New York and Philadelphia to Estonia, Russia, the UK, and for the past 17 years, France. As a freelance writer in the Moscow bureau of the New York Times in the mid-90s, Moscow, you guys notice? Douglas reported on a catastrophic oil spill in Russia's far north. So he has quite a history in Russia, which we're going to hear all about. Back in the U.S., he segued from covering Kremlin intrigue to the Philly suburbs as a reporter for the large metropolitan daily, the Philadelphia Inquirer. Douglas subsequently covered business and markets for CNN's financial news website in New York before crossing the pond to work at CNN International in London as a multimedia feature reporter focused on European issues. At France 24, a Paris-based news channel that he joined at its launch in 2006, Douglas gives his take on breaking international stories in both English and French. He has covered numerous G7 and G20 summits, from Mexico to Quebec to Northern Ireland, along with 4 U.S. presidential elections. In 2021, Douglas helped lead France 24's coverage of Biden-Harris inauguration from Washington, D.C. He received his master's degree in Russian studies from Harvard University, having studied in Moscow in the late 1980s, in the heyday of Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms.
I'm old.
Gorbachev. Oh, so old.
Getting there.
You're talking to the wrong
Well, it's all okay.
group.
It's all relative. Okay.
Many of us remember.
Since then, he has reported extensively from Russia and Ukraine and was live at the scene when Russian troops, the Little Green Men, occupied Crimea in February 2014. He's a regular conference speaker on U.S. politics and French and Russian politics and society. Douglas taught a graduate-level fact-checking course at Paris's Sciences Po Journalism School for 7 years, and I am very, very proud to welcome him today. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you. Yeah. Too much crammed into that biography. I should have edited myself a little better there. But I'll begin by just divulging something I probably shouldn't even say in front of Adrian. But I almost didn't make it here today because I was supposed to be reporting from Moscow this afternoon. But so at the last minute, well, the rest is history, really. Yeah, we were about to go. Sort of the bags are packed, situation. And what's never happened to me before in my entire career of being based abroad and going back and forth and covering Moscow is our station, France 24, like a lot of other stations, as you know, have basically pulled the plug for now on live broadcasts out of Moscow. Really, I mean, I can't overstate how shocking it is because when, you hear the BBC, CNN, RFE-RL, Radio Free Europe, all of us pulling out, not pulling our journalists out, they're physically still there. A lot of them are remaining in Moscow while they hope to ride out a very bad patch. How long that will be, we don't know. But the decision not to continue what we call live duplexes, live shots, because literally it was impossible in the current context to do so. And the current context being, obviously, as you know, or if you don't know, if you haven't been following recently in the past few days, the Russian parliament passed in the past 4 or 5 days a new law which, to boil it down, essentially criminalizes truthful journalism. In other words, it is impossible to do your job, report truthfully. What I mean is a factually based, fact-verified rigorous type of reporting is essentially not allowed. Now, the Russians obviously do not see it that way. They see themselves as trying to ensure that the Western propaganda isn't foisted on the world and on Russians as well. So they see it as a protective censorship mission, a friendly little sleight of hand. But the result is that I'm here today. I'm not in Moscow. Sort of, on standby if and when it is possible to go and get the lay of the land there. Like I said, it's shocking to me that I wasn't able to go, that we pulled the plug, because even in the darkest days of the Soviet Union, literally, going back to Stalin's time, you had Western correspondents based in the USSR, reporting from the USSR. You had William Salisbury at the New York Times. I mean, he made his name there. I mean, so it really gives you a sense. I've said on air, and by the way, I preface everything by saying I am a commentator. So by definition, I do editorialize. I give opinion. I call it sort of objective opinion, because I like to think that the opinions I give on air are not just coming out of left field. I give them based on what I hope is a lot of research, speaking to people, a thorough knowledge of what I'm talking about. So I'm not just spewing, at least I hope not, misinformation and disinformation. So yes, I give opinion, but I'd like to think that the opinion I give is responsible opinion, which is why I say in quotes, objective opinion. But so there have always been correspondents in the USSR, and I find this literally a chilling time. I was speaking the other day in our newsroom with one of our longtime Moscow-based correspondents, Elena, who just got back. She left. She made the decision to leave Russia after many, many years there, 10 plus years. She's Franco-Russian, knows the country inside out, bilingual. The fact that people like that feel that they cannot stay in Russia right now and report from that country is absolutely remarkable. So that's sort of giving you a little bit of the context here. The context of just what, I have to use the word again, a chilling time we are living in terms of trying to be a journalist reporting from Russia or about Russia. Even before this current period, this current war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion, there were a host of correspondents, as you probably are aware, Western correspondents, who've essentially been forced to leave. They've had their visas revoked. They've been forced out of the country. Sarah Rainsford, the BBC, is a recent case in point, but there were many who preceded her. So it's not that this all happened overnight. But the climate for journalism and reporting in Russia, and not just foreign journalists, obviously Russian journalists, they're in the direct line of fire, it has been getting more restrictive. The space for free expression, for free reporting, for free investigative, independent inquiry has been shrinking and shrinking. So it's like the anvil has fallen from the sky in the past few days. And two other things that hit me before I get into sort of the meat of what I want to talk about is there were two longtime major independent Russian language news outlets. One is called Echo Moskvy, the Echo of Moscow. Echo of Moscow was actually set up in the Soviet days. It was set up in the 1980s, and it was listened to, despite its name, Echo of Moscow. It was broadcast widely and well beyond Moscow. It had millions of people in Russia listening to it. And it was one of the few news outlets in Russia which all through the Putin period, as that space has become more and more restricted, was allowed miraculously to continue to broadcast independent voices, a range of opinion across the spectrum. I sometimes listen to their debates and I'd be like, wow, they're actually letting her on or him on? Wow, you don't see them anywhere on Russian state media. It was a station that was able to sort of buck the trends and seemingly get away with anything editorially. So they were literally forced off the air, and equally shocking because they were owned. Gazprom, which is Russia's largest, one of the world's largest actually, companies, the big Russian gas giant, they essentially owned a controlling share in Echo of Moscow. So if anyone seemed to have cover, an umbrella, protection against the Russian government shutting them down or forcing them out, it would have been Echo of Moscow. When they closed down, when they were yanked from the air, you can still follow them on YouTube. But when they were yanked off the air in Russia, that was really a wake-up call. That's when I was like, wow, this is a new dimension we're in. This is the twilight zone that we're entering. And the other outlet I talked about is not on the same scale, but it was Russia's essentially last independent television station. It was called TV Dozhd, which is TV Rain. And what it was is originally it was actually on television. You turned on a television, you could watch it on the air. In recent years, it was yanked off the airwaves and it went to the internet. So it was an internet-based television station. A lot of very energetic, very good young reporters who really shrank at nothing and really reported, as I see it, very truthfully. Didn't shy away from the difficult, tough stories in a country where just about everyone now is shying away from the tough stories. So they have also essentially been pulled off the air. Their longtime editor has left Russia now with all of his top associates, with all of his editors. So it really is, I'm sitting here today and sort of, it's a different time. And it's very worrying because we have no idea what's coming next. And it's worrying in the sense of I'm not sure where a lot of Russians, especially the younger generation right now, are going to be turning for information, because up until now, the way to get your information, if you didn't rely on Russian state-controlled media, was to use VPNs, basically an opt-out. You can get around all the firewalls. So young Russians who are internet savvy, who wanted to seek out good information, reliable sources of information, especially if they were able to speak foreign languages, say English, and can read foreign websites, they all used VPNs, or they were able to go onto a lot of sites which were still readily accessible in Russia. That is now all shutting down. So even if you've just been sort of vaguely following the media part of this story in the past few days, you know Facebook's gone, you know that Twitter is gone. I mean, some people would say it's a great thing Facebook is gone, but Twitter's gone, Instagram is gone. Up until last week, I was able to, when I posted something, say on Facebook, friends in Russia told me they were still able to read the text. They couldn't see any of the videos or the photos. Now when I post something on Facebook, they don't even see the text anymore. So that's down, gone. And yes, it's easy to sort of dismiss it as, well, good riddance, because Facebook does nothing but disseminate, fake news and disinformation. That's not entirely true, because in a lot of cases, Facebook in Russia was also used as a platform for organizing protests, which I'll talk about later. But its disappearance, literally overnight, is very worrying. There's a Russian equivalent to all of these websites. In Russia, the equivalent to Facebook is called VKontakte, in contact. And it's a government-controlled, literally Kremlin-controlled version of Facebook, which is why a lot of the Russian friends that I know who are at all political, they do not post any political content on it, because it's a guaranteed ticket to, hey, read my content, censor me, arrest me, whatever. So it's purely a platform that Russians who are really serious about wanting to engage in any sort of discussion or debate, you're not going to post on VKontakte. So that's where we are media-wise right now. But I came because I wanted to sort of talk about disinformation, and I know I put that big word in my in sort of the title of the talk, disinformation. And one of the things that I just want to sort of be clear about is I'm going to say a lot of bad things about Putin and his Russia and his regime in the next 45 minutes or so. However, disinformation, obviously Russia does not have a monopoly on disinformation. Everyone's guilty of it to a certain extent. Disinformation is obviously, as defined, is misinformation, meaning the information's wrong, but unlike misinformation, which is a little more innocent, disinformation comes with intent. So there is an intention to try to deceive someone or to mislead them. Now, in the Soviet days, it was literally, they owned it. They called it propaganda. And it wasn't even a bad term. Propaganda was simply the state-sanctioned spreading of information. It was actually a good thing. You want to propaganda for the masses. We want to teach them about, educate them and give them culture. So it wasn't always a derogatory term to talk about propaganda. It started, disinformation sort of took on a derogatory term. I guess it was originally a sort of a Russian term. It was dezinformatsiya in Russian, disinformation. And it was the predecessor to the KGB, the GPU, which first started using this as a political tactic and a weapon, an indoctrination weapon, a way to brainwash the masses.
So you mean it didn't start with Donald Trump?
Didn't start with that. I'm sorry to disappoint you there, Adrian. No. Well before. In the Soviet Union, it became a weapon of the KGB early on. It was used by the Communist Party and its official media mouthpieces, Pravda, which you probably all know from another era, which was literally the official organ of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It was their mouthpiece, and they owned it. They weren't trying to shy away. They said, yes, we are the mouthpiece of Communist Party of Russia. That was what they did, and that's what they were. But today it's taken on, I think, many darker, more sinister undertones. The propaganda war, which I call it, because this is, as much as it is a horrific war in which people are literally being shelled, civilians trying to flee their homes are being shelled by rockets and artillery and are dying, probably as I speak, along so-called humanitarian corridors. While that is obviously a horrific part of this war, there's just as much an information war going on. And like I said, no one has a monopoly on misinformation and disinformation, right? This is both sides. The Ukrainians aren't angels, obviously. And yes, their defense ministry, their army, yes, they put out disinformation as well. My point today is, and I talked about this in the last talk here, is I'm trying to avoid false equivalency. I'm trying to avoid the type of journalism, on the one hand, the Russians say, on the other hand, the Ukrainians say. Because on the one hand, one side is a lot more wrong. One side is basically full of absolute egregious lies, and I would go so far as to call it, in some cases, delirium. Denial, lies, denial, and delirium. And the other side is doing what almost everyone does in times of war. They try to put out a certain degree of disinformation, misinformation, to try to boost the morale of their troops, to try to give their armed forces a little bit of boost. But the Russian disinformation here is on a different level, because it is disinformation which has been inculcated into an entire population over years and decades, and has really come to a head in this war, which brings me to the here and now. I've been watching a lot of Russian state television in the past week or so, because, the old adage, know thine enemy. Before I go on air and comment on something, I really want to sort of be in the frame of mind and hear, what did the average Russian, and I say average Russian, okay, the demographic is older generation Russians. Yes, it tends to be people more sort of, I would say, 50 or older in Russia, who grew up with television, getting their news from television. Not the web, not podcasts, not their favorite radio station, but really television. And they rely almost entirely, and we're talking tens of millions of people out of a population of almost 150 million in Russia, who rely entirely for their news diet on state television. When I talk about state television, it's not the same as saying, well, there's France 2 here in France. It's a public broadcaster. It's financed by the state. We're talking a different level of state television. This is literally Kremlin-financed, Kremlin-dictated television. Everything I have been talking about so far, if I had just given this talk in Moscow today, I would be subject under the new law that was just passed against spreading fake information. I'd be, in the state media. I would be subject to up to 15 years in prison. And not just any prison. It's actually a penal colony, which is worse than prison. I couldn't use the word war. I couldn't use the word invasion. I think I used both those words in the first two sentences that came out of my mouth. I couldn't say war. I couldn't say invasion. I couldn't say attack. I couldn't generally say anything that casts aspersion in the eyes of the Kremlin, as they see it, that casts aspersion on the Russian armed forces, that discredits the Russian army in any way, shape, or form. How do you do that? It's, like I said at the beginning, it is almost impossible. So I've been watching a lot of Russian state media. I've been watching what's called the First Channel, which is called Первый канал, which is the most watched state television channel in Russia. I've been watching a station called NTV, which when I was working there, way back, back in the 90s, when Russia had actually a flourishing infosphere, there were so many sources of information you didn't know where to start. They actually even published the New York Times weekly edition translated into Russian at newsstands in the Moscow metro. It was unbelievable. It was the tyranny of choice. You had so much information. Today, none of that exists. So you basically have NTV, which used to be a freewheeling, relatively independent source of information, now has been, the noose is tightened. It is controlled tightly by the state. They broadcast also the official Kremlin line. You have Россия 24, Russia 24. Please do not confuse that with France 24. Never the twain shall meet. At least I'd like to think so. Russia 24 is what, when I was first covering the annexation of Crimea and then went back to cover the occupation by the pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine, this is what they were all watching. All the soldiers, all the paramilitary, all the mercenaries would stand around their checkpoints. If they had like a TV set or they had their phones or whatever, they would be watching Russia 24, which was the purest propaganda. It was like it was drinking stiff vodka, but like the information equivalent of the stiffest vodka you could think of. There's actually this Russian drink called cha-cha, which has like a 40% and a 70%. It's like drinking the 70% alcohol cha-cha. That's what this information is like. Yeah, yeah, but it's like that dark chocolate, which is like 90% cocoa, and you're like, it's inedible. You can't actually eat it. You know, it's like so much cocoa. Yeah. I've been watching Russian television, and here is what I've been updating each day. Sort of one of my themes in my commentaries has been just trying to take a step back and remind our viewers of what the Russians don't know about the war right now. Because it's very easy for people to sort of get furious at the Russians and wonder why aren't more Russians out in the streets protesting? Yes, there have been large numbers, thousands across dozens of cities. They've been arrested here left and right and beaten up by police. But why haven't there been more of them? How could there not be a whole country rising up? Because the propaganda is extremely effective. What they don't know, just a little checklist. They don't know there's a war going on. What is happening right now in Ukraine is, I'm not making this up, what is happening right now in Ukraine, according to the permissible state line, what they're allowed to report on Russian state television, is friendly Russian peacekeeping forces have entered Ukraine in order to come to the assistance to protect Russian speakers. That is, Russian speakers, when I use that, it's a broad term. Russian speakers originally in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, that could be ethnic Russians who live in Ukraine. They're remnants of the old Soviet Empire who are there. It could be people who were born in Ukraine, but they consider Russian sort of their more dominant language. They speak Russian before they'll speak Ukrainian on the street. And just anyone else who happens to speak Russian, who Vladimir Putin considers part of sort of one Slavic brotherhood. So the friendly, peacekeeping Russian troops were coming to Ukraine as liberators and protectors of the ethnic Russians and the Russian speakers who, now what are they protecting them from? So follow the logic here. The propaganda logic is they are protecting them from the Nazi, fascist Ukrainians, potentially nuclear armed, about to commit genocide against them. Let me say that again. They're there to protect them against the Nazi, neo-fascist, Ukrainian, what was the other one? Protect them against genocide, basically, potentially nuclear armed. This has been another big theme in the Russian press. Ukraine did have nuclear arms during the Soviet era. What you will never hear in the Soviet propaganda is that Ukraine signed a paper in 1991, 94, 94, right? It was 94, thank you.
Yes.
Giving them up.
US and Russia
That's it.
agreed to take them.
We hereby relinquish our nuclear weapons. There are a lot of Ukrainians who wish they had held on to them. But they gave them up. But that doesn't filter into the propaganda. The propaganda is these are lunatic neo-Nazis. Now, the head of the Nazis in Ukraine, the head of this lunatic mob of fascist nationalist neo-Nazis in Ukraine is Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. He is the Nazi in chief. Now, what is the caveat there? What is the big disclaimer? Yeah, big disclaimer. Big disclaimer. Zelensky is Jewish. His grandfather had 3 brothers who were killed in the Holocaust. Zelensky himself gave a speech in Russian. He speaks Ukrainian to the Ukrainians. He gave a speech in the Russian language to the Russian people last week in which he brought up these points. Wasn't me. Wasn't me just saying he's Jewish. This isn't some conspiracy theory. You know, I didn't submit his DNA to one of those Ancestor.com sites. Zelensky himself told the Russian people in his address, I'm Jewish. I lost family members in the Holocaust. He asked Putin, how can I be a Nazi? He put it that bluntly, because how else do you put it when you're a Jew who lost family members in the Holocaust being accused with a straight face by the leader of a country invading you that you're a Nazi? So these are the things the Russians don't know, but the list goes on. The Russians do not know that there are Ukrainian refugees to the tune of, as of before I came here this afternoon, 2 million. It's now 2 million. I know if you blinked, if you got up this morning and were watching CNN, it was 1.7 million, right? Well, guess what? It's 2 million now. So 2 million refugees, that's not happening. In Russia, that's not happening. What you do have happening is you have terrified ethnic Russian residents of the eastern Ukrainian regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbass region, terrified residents. They're the ones who are fleeing, and that's why the soldiers are there, to help them, to protect them against the encroaching, threatening Ukrainian army. Before I go further, I just want to give you the facts about the Ukrainian army and the Russian army. I don't know if we have any military people here, but the Russian army, Putin has modernized the Russian army to the tune of, now he spends $45 billion a year on it. It's still nothing. It's a drop in the ocean compared to, say, the US military budget, which is, I think, upwards of $850 billion a year now. But so $45 billion for Putin. He's modernized the army. He's recruited a lot of new soldiers. They've also put a lot of money into mercenaries, which is a whole topic for another day. The Wagner Group, you've probably heard of them. Syrian mercenaries are now coming to, reportedly, but I'll take the word purportedly out. Syrian soldiers are coming to the battlefield as well in Ukraine right now. So $45 billion for a mighty Russian army. And it is a mighty, I think it's the fourth or fifth, maybe someone knows more about this particular, I'm not a military expert, but I think it's the fourth or fifth largest standing army in the world. As far as troops, I think North Korea has the most actual standing operational troops. What do you think Ukraine has invested, yearly, it's their budget? And remember, Ukraine, since 2014, when I was reporting from there first, they had a pipsqueak army. They were totally unprepared and ill-trained. They were nothing. The army had to be almost built from scratch. Since 2014, over the past 8 years, so Russia spends $45 billion. What is Ukraine? What's like, any guesses? What Ukraine? No, Ukraine compared to Russia. Russia's $45 billion.
Yeah, something.
But yeah, you're going in the right direction.
Something
it's
really
about
tiny.
$4.5 billion. $4.5 billion. So we're talking about an army that is literally a tenth the size of Ukraine's army. Its soldiers are still, despite the upped budget, the stepped up budget, and the weapons being sent from NATO countries, it's still a pipsqueak army compared to Russia. So you just have to understand that context. When the Russian army talks about, and when Putin goes on television with a deadpan straight face, talks about, the Kremlin propaganda disinformation line, we are being threatened by the Ukrainians and their army. I mean, it would be laughable if it weren't actually playing out in real time with a war right now, with an invasion in response. It's totally bogus. Putin knows it's bogus. His associates know it's bogus. The propaganda is highly, highly effective. So there is a threat. If you're a Russian watching state TV, there is a clear and present danger from this extremely dangerous, potentially nuclear-armed Ukrainian army. As soon as they can get their hands on that nuclear field from their nuclear sites, they have those weapons ready to go. That is the official propaganda line. So there's no refugee crisis. There's no war. Guess what else there isn't? None. And I've scanned all of it. I actually tried to find it. There is no bombardment of Ukrainian cities going on. Nothing. There's no bombardment. So how does that translate? So I don't know about you, but in the past few days, I've been waking up daily to pictures of cities such as Kherson, Kharkiv, Mariupol, the latest one being Sumy in the north, devastated, razed. Looks like, Hurricane Andrew magnified 100 times blowing through these places. Not military targets, civilian targets. Civilian targets being hit. Not me saying it. These are video images, our reporters on the ground verifying. We have whole teams of people who actually verify videos, verify the photos we send back. Verification experts led by people like the Bellingcat Investigative Agency. If you don't know Bellingcat, they're great. Follow them on Facebook or whatever, Instagram, Twitter. They're magnificent, doing magnificent work, important work. So the Russians do not know, if they are watching state TV, that there is right now one of the worst sieges, post-war World War II sieges in Europe right now going on of a sovereign country. And I'll use the word sovereign, peaceful country in an objective way. When I talk about objective opinion, sovereign, peaceful Ukraine. They were unprovoked in this. Now, I preface that by I'll add, no, Ukrainians are not angels. Yes, in Ukraine, there is a such thing in Ukraine as fascist militias. They do exist. That's why any propaganda, all propaganda can only be effective and exist if there's a tiny grain of truth in it. There's something you can latch onto and then blow it out of proportion and totally take it out of context. So when they talk about fascists in Ukraine, there is a history during World War II, as anyone who knows their history will know. Yeah, there were partisans in Ukraine who did actually ally with the Nazis and did fight on those sides, the Banderovцы. But in general, the Ukrainian population are not Nazis. The fascist segment of the Ukrainian population is a tiny infinitesimal part. I've been to Ukraine on many occasions. I've gone all over the country. I have literally gone around knocking on doors, asking people, excuse me, so the Russians say this is where the Nazis live. Do you know Nazis in the area? I mean, it's ludicrous. It's literally laughable. But this is what the Russians honestly have drilled into them. And when I'm in Russia and you speak to them, it is literally, I keep using the term they drunk the Kool-Aid, because imagine an entire population where everyone has had hardwired into their DNA this notion of the Ukrainians being these neo-Nazi fascists out to get them and commit genocide. So all of this narrative, this falsified narrative, is what most of the Russian population believes. So,
On this issue of bombardments and what have you, combat action, a few days ago, the media were reporting that the Russians did acknowledge on state television that
the Kiev Tower.
That about 500 of the soldiers had been killed in action. And I'm wondering, how did they put that into any kind of context?
Yeah.
I mean, because the news report that I heard almost gave it no context. It was almost as if it was just a number that was thrown out. And then references to the heroes of the...
Absolutely. Let me put that in context. You're absolutely right.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was, I was saying that basically, about the bombardments, that there was, while I was saying that none of this has really been reported, the other day the Russians did put out a figure of 500 Russian soldiers' lives lost. They acknowledged the loss of Russian soldiers' lives. The actual number was 498, right? They made it really specific, right? Like we've counted 498. They put it out because there was a lot of stuff. The videos were breaking through despite the censors' attempts in Russia on social media. A lot of Russians who weren't supposed to be seeing these videos were seeing them. And the Russian army knew that they couldn't completely reject out of hand. It would sound ridiculous. It's like saying Kim Jong-un in North Korea is elected with 99.9% of the vote. They had to at least put out, this is my reading of it, some number to make it look plausible that they're not denying that there's been loss of life, this is war, but just to give you sort of a sense, at the very same time, the Ukrainians, as you know, were putting out numbers of Russian losses which were far in excess to that. It was 4,000 to 10,000, according to which Ukrainian source you listen to. And as of today, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is saying more than 16,000 Russian lives have been lost, which now, I'm not saying the Ukrainian figure, I remember I talked about both sides use propaganda. There's probably bits of propaganda in the Ukrainian figures. They want to boost their own troops' morale. I much more, though, I think the ballpark figure is much closer to that 16,000 than to the 500 right now, what the Ukrainians. I think, though, to answer that, you couldn't avoid it. There's a certain amount. You can't completely airtight seal everything against some sort of truth. The truth will out, ultimately. You can criminalize journalism. You can make it criminal to do your honest reporting job. But with all of the types of media today and the social platforms, it will come out, which leads me to, it's a good question because it leads me to my next point. So the other danger to this Russia propaganda, the sort of crack in the edifice. So I'll give you one example just from my own experience. So my wife happens to be Russian. This is called burying the lead, as they say in journalism. Burying, what do you mean your wife is Russian? You've been sitting biased, you know. No. My wife is Russian. She's here, obviously, in Paris. And she has a friend, one of her best friends is visiting Paris right now, who comes from the same town in Russia, in Yekaterinburg, which is in the Urals region of Russia. Happened to be here well before this Russian invasion. Once again, I'm 15 years in the penal colony for me. Happened to be here before the Russian invasion, is still here because the airspaces have been closed. She can't get back. She has been, I've been feeding her accurate sources of information. I threw away the teaspoon. I bring out the big soup spoon. I bring it over and I feed it to her. But no, on a more serious note, she has been exposed. I guess that is a more balanced term. Exposed to a lot of information which in Russia she would not normally be exposed to. She has been seeing all of these images. She's horrified and shocked by what she's seeing across Western news networks, and at the same time she's horrified and shocked by what I just told you the Russians aren't seeing. She's been looking at her own Russian news sites, and then she's been looking at the parallel reality, which I claim is the real, the here and now, true universe of sane reality, of what's going on. She has tried to speak to her family back in Russia. She has half of her family in Ukraine and half of her family in Russia. She has tried to speak to her family, to her parents. I'm sure a lot of you have either read stories about this or heard stories about it. I'm not the first one talking about it, obviously, about the difficulties right now. And I guess that's an understatement, not the difficulties, the impossibility of breaching that divide even within families right now, where in some cases this Russian friend's family in Ukraine has tried to call the parents in Russia to say, our town is right now under shelling, under Russian shelling. We are being shelled. What do the families say? What do you think the families say to her?
They don't believe her.
They don't believe it, but if they do believe it, they say that this is the other great propaganda line, and this one I actually don't know how it works so effectively. It is that the Ukrainians are shelling themselves. False flag. The Ukrainians are shooting themselves. The Ukrainians are also attacking and aiming at their own. I'm just trying to get this logic straight. They're also aiming at and attacking their own nuclear plants so that they could blame the Russians. So it's all part of a very savvy propaganda campaign. That's really savvy. Yeah, let's nuke our entire country so we could blame it on the Russians. Got it. No, just let's give them the benefit of the doubt.
That's not the first time
That's no, exactly. So, but going back, the point is families are being divided here because you literally get families on the phone, and these are not, by the way, I'm not trying to belittle these people back in Russia. A lot of them are fiercely bright, very smart, educated, cultured people who drank the Kool-Aid, who basically have been brought up on this propaganda, and it is so virulent. And I also believe, and I was discussing this with William before, and I agree with him, that it goes beyond simply the fact that they are watching these propaganda outlets day in and day out and have no access to any other source of information. This is their worldview, their only prism. It's also because their identity is caught up in it. If you live your entire life in one belief system, and suddenly you have someone coming along and saying, well, actually, everything you believe it's the reverse. It's all wrong. You know? You're gonna cling to what you believe in, and you are gonna lash out, and you are going to resist. You're not gonna all of a sudden say, oh, actually, yes. I remember speaking during one of the campaigns, the first Trump campaign in 2016. I was in Puxatawny, Pennsylvania. Also visiting, yes, the groundhog, yes. Okay, yes, it was one of my cheesier reports ever. I interviewed the groundhog, and I will not tell you who the groundhog voted for. I know. But, so I was in Puxatawny, Pennsylvania, and I was just testing, we were doing a report on, there were a lot of Trump supporters there. We were on our way to the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia, but this part of Pennsylvania was very heavily Trump voters. And I tried to factually give them factual evidence about things that were simply flew in the face of what Trump was telling them. I wasn't trying to tell them they were wrong. I wasn't saying that, I wasn't trying to tell them who they should vote for. I was just saying, well, actually what you're saying is, what he's telling you is wrong. The fact is A, B, and C. They wouldn't want to believe it, so in other words, even when presented with factual evidence, they will not believe it often, because believing the facts requires debunking and dismantling their whole belief scaffolding, their whole system. So they can't do it. It's a protective system. Presented with the factual evidence, a lot of people will reject it out of hand, which is why fact-checking itself becomes a politicized industry. A lot of people view fact-checkers as politically motivated. They're not journalists who are trying to get clean, proper, right information out. They are people who are trying to promote an agenda. So then we're on very difficult, very slippery, very dangerous ground. So you ask me, so how do you deal with that? What do you do with this? I have no answer for that question. I don't right now know how, and I've spent a lot of time in Russia with families who, sometimes I'm just too tired to try to argue with it. Sometimes I just avoid politics altogether because it's just the easier option. Let's just talk about mushroom soup, you know? Let's talk about let's borscht. Let's talk about fishing. Let's anything. Vodka. Let's talk about the best vodka. So I avoid politics a lot. Sometimes I just try to sit there and listen to them. I just try to sort of listen to what they have to say, and then I might just throw something out there, just innocently, like ask them a question about something, as if I'm curious about something, but my curiosity is really trying to sort of poke into their belief system a little bit. But it's really tough. It's really tough, and then the other level of it is Putin himself. People say, so does Putin, is he just the world's biggest monstrous cynic, or does he believe it himself? Does his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, believe it? I have a sort of nuanced take on this. I think Putin does believe his own propaganda. I think with some politicians, it's easy to dismiss them and saying they're just being cynics, they're manipulating. I think he has been stewing in it for so long. He grew up on it. A former KGB guy, worked in Eastern Germany. This is his worldview. This is not a man who grew up or is ever surrounded by democratic elements. And I think that he's become, and Macron himself said this, after Macron had the table of the long meeting, I'm calling it. The table of the long meeting. Remember that table? Went on forever. The table of the long meeting, Macron came away and said, wow, my impression was he's different. He's changed a lot since I last saw him. When I saw him in France in 2018 at Fort Plégançon, it was a different Putin. He was harder in his views. He was more difficult to penetrate. He was more sitting there talking at me, lecturing to me. So everyone in Macron and the entourage with him was sort of struck by this, like a different Putin. A different Putin. So, and I think that the pandemic obviously hasn't helped. Putin has literally been the most isolated for a while. I think he's maybe one of the most isolated people in the world. He already was a man, very paranoid, keeping a very small circle around him. But when the pandemic started, he literally holed up in his dacha, in his residence, just outside the Moscow city limits. Anyone who wanted to visit him, and there were very few visitors allowed, had to obviously test negative, but they had to isolate for 2 weeks and then test negative, PCR test. So isolate for 2 weeks, test negative. But then there was the final step where you had to walk through this sort of gauntlet of sanitizing spray. It was like a shower of gel and disinfectant being sprayed on you, and then you're like in a HAPHAZ suit, ChemHaz suit, and all of that. So this was a man who was pretty paranoid about his own health. Which, by the way, the only good news about this, in my opinion, is he's so paranoid, I think, about his own health and his own well-being, he's not going to use the nukes, because, he cares about himself, unless you're to assume he has a bunker down there where he'll be safe.
The bunkers in New Zealand.
Yeah, the young female flight attendants. He's now making lots of exceptions, you'll see. The people now he does, but you'll see, he met with his defense ministers. It's been like a joke. The images they've shown on Russian state media, and which have been picked up by all of us because they're the only images we have of Putin in these meetings, they're almost comically funny. They look like the opening of a Saturday Night Live sketch where he's sitting here and that his military brass is sitting, as far as you are all the way down there. It's like you need a megaphone yeah, to speak to them. And they're like sort of cowering in the corner. He was all the way at the other end. And so a lot of the meetings. And then when he met with his security council, you saw his defense security council. They were sort of arrayed around him, but at a distance. Putin sort of, studiously distanced from everyone else, royally distanced. So yeah, I think Putin, I think Lavrov, to a certain extent, his foreign minister for the entire time, practically, of Putin's tenure, reign in office, whatever you want to call it. I believe they really believe their own propaganda. I believe they are victims of their own propaganda, which makes it actually twice as dangerous. So when Putin, well, you think he's more cynical? Well, we can.
If you notice, Lavrov never figures in the inner circle around Putin in any of the reporting that I've seen or read.
You're absolutely right.
I think he's, but I think he knows that if he's going to continue to be foreign minister, or he's going to continue to have his head.
Yeah.
He's basically got to continue to be, the good soldier as far as.
It's true, but the only thing I take your point, William. I guess the one thing I would counter with is I've been at a lot of these summits and press conferences where Lavrov's attending, and there's always this time, and this happens when you're covering any diplomatic event, whether it's a G7 or a World Bank summit or whatever. There's a time when they have the official press conference on camera, and then they have the time off camera, where you speak to these diplomats, or when the New York Times says, according to a senior administration official, it's often the Secretary of State who you just heard quoted above, but now I'm just a senior administration official. So, and we've had these sort of in the side chats with Lavrov, and this is usually where you get an insight into what they really are thinking and what they're really feeling. You can sort of speak, okay, but this isn't for attribution, this is sort of off the record. And he'll repeat exactly the same line that he was just repeating in the official press conference as Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister, as he'll do off the record, not for attribution, later on the sidelines. Like, there's no letting down of the guard at any point.
Well, I would agree that there was a major change with Lavrov following the 2014 crisis in Ukraine.
Yeah, yeah.
Until that point, if you remember, Lavrov,
He was soft.
John Kerry,
Yeah.
wrote the safety rope.
You're right.
For Syria.
Yeah, he
But
did.
then once things heated up in Ukraine,
Yeah.
Lavrov seemed to have changed and hardened a bit. But
Look, no, there's no definitive answer here. I mean, there are people who will tell you that Lavrov's just trying to protect his own ass, because you can't defy Putin. There's no such thing as a naysayer in Vladimir Putin's. You just can't do it. I mean, the defense minister, a guy named Sergei Shoigu, he's like Putin's hunting and fishing buddy, and they go shoot bear together. And so you wonder, can Shoigu say anything to Putin? And you saw that video maybe the video where the defense ministers were sitting at the ends of the table. There was this moment where if you zoom in on Sergei Shoigu's face, this is the moment where Putin said to him, I now order you to put all of our nuclear forces on high defense alert. And you saw, excuse my accent there, but put nuclear forces, defense, high alert. And there was a moment where, at least the way I read his expression, he was sort of horrified by what he was hearing, but he couldn't show it. And he sort of looked down for a second, and his face sort of melted for a second, and then he was back in character. Then it was like this quick, fleeting glimpse of, is he really saying that? Holy shit. And then realizing, okay, I can't show it. I have.
also had the FSB director.
You had Narishkin as well. Narishkin was absolutely. Narishkin dared one of his the FSB directors, Borotnikov, actually, was another guy who was the head of, I think, national intelligence or something. But one of his intelligence chiefs also went off the script. Putin had a meeting where everyone was supposed to rubber stamp Putin's decision, or the parliament's request for Putin to officially recognize to officially recognize the self-proclaimed separatist People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. And everyone, you're supposed to go around the table. Putin says, what do you think? I want to hear all of your views. And you go around, and, as if, that's really the moment. Well, actually, Vlad, I think it's a horrible idea, So you're going around the table, and they're all in role, but you got to the last guy, Narishkin, who misunderstood the question and he said to Putin, yes, I think we should annex them. He went overboard. He overshot. He misunderstood, or he was nervous, so he misanswered Putin's question, and Putin chewed him out. That wasn't the question. I asked if we should recognize, not annexation. So, and then all of a sudden he was very nervous. He was extremely nervous, and you sort of saw it. I mean, it's the same expression that you sometimes would see like in those old photos of the Soviet censors, or like you go against Stalin, or something. You do not say anything against Stalin. It's like this, you cannot say anything against Putin. So, I mean, yes, other people have different readings of it. I still think, whether you think it's Vlad the Mad or Vlad the Rational, or my take, Vlad the Rational Mad, that there's still basic fear of him. There's a fear of Putin. There is a general acceptance of no one going against him. If there is going to be anyone who sort of breaks the mold or dares to defy him, it's going to be very difficult. One of Putin's heroes is Lavrentiy Beria. Beria was the Stalinist, Putin really admires Beria. Beria was the Stalinist police chief who perhaps was the most feared person, including Putin, in all of Soviet and Russian history. I mean, he was more powerful than anyone else in the Soviet Union because he had everyone's secrets. They finally got him at a party conference. His underlings, his deputies below him, at great risk to their own lives, conspired essentially against them. In the middle of the conference, they arrested him. And Beria knew better than anyone what his fate was going to be. They knew he was going to be immediately executed because that was his playbook, and he was. It's almost a similar scenario, and I think that Putin realizes it. Being a KGB guy, Putin knows that if he loses control of his underlings, he thinks the way a KGB person's going to think. He knows what could potentially happen to him. I think he is sort of right now, everything is calculated with that in mind. He is determined to go for broke in his propaganda, in keeping the Russians as ill-informed and disinformed as he possibly can, and making sure that there is no possibility that within his own ranks there could be any divisions against him. And I think for now he can cling on pretty well. But just to end this, I started with the topic of disinformation, and I just wanted to say that what's going on right now in the here today with the humanitarian corridors, the so-called humanitarian corridors, they're supposed to be safe passages to allow Ukrainian civilians to flee the onslaught, right? Whether from Russian or Ukrainian troops, right? Roads that they will be safe from fire. So just before I came here, one of those supposedly safe humanitarian corridors had already broken down in Mariupol, and because there was shelling again, artillery shelling. My objective opinion on that is you don't have to look far to guess. This wasn't a false flag operation on Ukrainian troops. This was Russian shelling on them. Russian artilleries, Russian shells on these evacuation jets. We saw this in Syria too with the evacuation corridors. This is not something that the Russians have just made up. These tactics are brutal, they are cynical, they are horrible, they are destructive and devastating, but they have been around a long time. So I have very little hope for the so-called humanitarian corridors, not to even mention the fact that joke with the humanitarian corridors is one of them led to Russia. So, okay, let's evacuate. Here's the logic. This is a good one. Let's evacuate Ukrainian civilians to the country that's invading them. Got it. And the other one, leaving from Kiev, was going originally. It changed today. The Russians say, well, now they can choose where they want to go, which route they want to take. But as of yesterday, it was going to Belarus. So taking them to the ally of the country that's invading them. Yeah, if I were a Ukrainian civilian and me and my family were under heavy shelling and artillery fire, I think, what do you take? Curtain 1, road to Russia. Curtain 2, road to Belarus. I mean, it's like, it's a horrible choice. It's a horrific choice. So the humanitarian corridors are sort of, unfortunately, I mean, they should be what they are. They actually should be a way to get civilians safely out of those cities, even if the motives for the Russians are bad. Putin's motive is obvious, in my opinion. It is get them out so he could step up and really bomb the cities, really bomb the hell out of them, at least get some of the civilians out. Then he could at least say, look, we gave the civilians a chance to get out. We, the peace-loving Russians, we're the ones who opened up these humanitarian corridors. The Ukrainians wouldn't let them get out. The Ukrainians started bombing them as they were trying to get out of their country. Now, I know that's a very one-sided opinion, But I still say it's objective opinion based on what I have seen and witnessed on the ground in the past, whether it was in Donbass, I saw the same types of evacuations in 2014. It's always the same script. And I will guarantee you one thing, no matter what happens, whatever goes wrong with these operations, the Russians will, in their state media, blame the Ukrainians, with the very rare exception where they will make some acknowledgments, like William pointed out, where we have lost 498 soldiers. But they will find a way of the Ukrainians are shooting it at the civilians, the Ukrainians are shooting at themselves, the Ukrainians are targeting their nuclear plants. It's the Ukrainians doing all these false flag operations in order to make us look bad. And that all feeds back into that larger, broader Russian narrative of everyone's out to get us, ultimately. Beyond Ukraine, the West. The West is out to humiliate us, to bring us down. This is between Putin and Ukraine. He's obviously mad at Ukraine defying Putin and daring to tilt west, to tilt towards Europe. But on a more visceral level, this is personal between Putin and the United States. Putin is furious. He's in a revanchist rage against the United States for what he says as a completely orchestrated collapse of the Soviet Empire, which we all know Putin called the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, famously, notoriously called it that, and wanting to get back and set things right, to rectify the world situation. So Putin is not right now, as some Russian, Ukrainian friends have said, Putin, in his view, is not being a Hitlerian maniac. He's not going full Stalin. What Putin is doing right now is he is ensuring that the Russian people get their lands back, get their lost empire back, and he's pushing it. He's pushing the envelope because he actually believes at the end of the day, he wants the Russians to believe that this is also what the Ukrainians want, that they would be welcomed with open arms as sort of liberators when the Russian troops got there. This is the point where I think the Russian propaganda and the Russian disinformation campaign is going to have more and more trouble hiding. They're going to have more and more trouble patching over the fact that no, those invading Russian troops are not being welcomed with open arms. How do you get the body bags back? How much of that do you report? When do you go from 500 soldiers lost more to, what's the next number going to be? 2,000, 3,000? How many tanks will they admit that they have lost? You can log on to the Ukrainian government website. You'll see all the figures each day of what they say the Russians have lost. Then you could see what the Russians acknowledge at the Russian Defense Ministry site. Right now, I see the numbers are very low. I didn't write them down before I came. They're extremely low. I think those numbers are going to remain very low, but they'll always be an excuse. The Russians will always find a pretext. It's not us. Blame it on the Ukrainians. Blame it on someone else. So I have no answers for it. I sort of give the lay of the land. That's the disinformation as it exists right now. I don't know what to do about it. It's pretty grim, and it's pretty grim for someone like me who, like I said, I started out working in Russia at a time when it was unbelievable how much choice for information you had. It was chaotic as hell too. It was the Yeltsin years. It was the Wild West. Anything went. Crime was horrible. There was mafia, shoot to kill all over the place. Russians will tell you the 90s was one of the most dangerous, fearful eras, but it also was, ironically, paradoxically, a very information-free era. And especially at the end of the 90s, there was actually some hope. At the end of the 80s, I'm sorry, there was actually some hope at the end of Gorbachev's reforms that maybe, before the putsch at least, that maybe there would be some sort of hope for a more democratic style of government in Russia, a more democratic future. So you could tell I don't have the most optimistic take right now on it. I have a pretty sort of, unfortunately, I wish I could be more optimistic, but it is pretty grim, my outlook for the immediate future. Because I don't see what's going to turn the tide right now, at least on the propaganda front in Russia with the disinformation war. I don't see the scales all of a sudden falling from all these Russians' eyes unless there's some sort of rebellion from within, breaking down of firewalls and mass internal protest and dissent within Russia, which I don't see happening. The only thing I see perhaps possible in this scenario is something internal against Putin, but like I said, I'm not holding my breath for that either. I think it's much more likely that there would be some internal fracturing or some plot against Putin from within his own ranks than from actually the grassroots, despite all those images of extremely brave people showing out in the streets in Petersburg and Moscow and elsewhere across Russia. So yeah, and as far as using nukes, I also, Russian nuclear expert, one of them I listened to the other day, him and a former Russian member of Putin's inner circle, an oligarch named Sergei Pugachev, who is now in exile. He knows Putin well, and he believes Putin will not use nuclear weapons. He says he would like to use nuclear weapons, but he doesn't know how, and the immediate generals around him are not nuclear-trained engineers. They don't know how. He believes the human factor, as it did with the Bay of Pigs, the human factor on a certain level will intervene at a certain point, and the low-level grunts, who are the ones who can actually launch those missiles, will not do it.
And that's what happened in 83 or whatever.
83 as well.
The Soviet low-level general in
The
the
Persian.
command post, basically said,
You're right.
watching all of this able archer stuff happening, and they went
That's it.
prong one. He said, no, this isn't for real. This is a drill.
He called them out, right? Yeah, that's it. He said he called them out. He said this is a bluff, and well, not a bluff, but so that's where my hopes lie. That on those low level, the geeks, the engineers, the people who have the nuclear technical know-how of how to actually launch those things, they just won't do it. But hey, I could be totally wrong. I also said that Trump wouldn't be elected, and I said Brexit would never happen. So how much you want to believe anything I say, So there you go. But yeah, thanks for putting up with that long spiel. Yeah, I guess there's some.
So despite the effectiveness of the economic sanctions and the impact that they're obviously having on Russia, do you see anything short of Chinese intervention preventing the full overrunning of Ukraine and possibly annexation?
Well, I'll take that from the sanctions end. I'm a sanctions pessimist. I've always been a sanctions pessimist, and I know the argument that this is a whole nother magnitude of sanctions, the likes of which Russia has never seen. And yeah, that's true. There have never been sanctions. There's never been this much of the financial system disconnected, from SWIFT to the central bank to all the Western companies except for McDonald's and Coca-Cola pulling out of Russia. It's been massive. But I don't think Putin's factored it in. It's like on Wall Street where a company, before it reports its results, they write it off. They write some tragic event off, and that therefore it doesn't really affect their bottom line or their results because we already knew it was going to happen. And I think the Russians sort of, they know, they've been living with it. They're stoic, they're stolid. And the other thing, the reasons I think the sanctions will be less effective than perhaps the West would like to think they'll be. They will, they're definitely having an impact. The ruble's right now, the dollar's at 134, 135, that was yesterday. The euro's at 140 something to the ruble. I mean, it's gone like this. It's unbelievable, but it's cratering the ruble right now. But a lot of Russians, remember, are also disconnected from a lot of that economy already. In other words, after
They're also disconnected from the voice. And that's what you've been saying.
Yeah, they're disconnected from.
So how they?
Well, they still feel financial. They know. I mean, they know if their cards aren't working. But what Russia's been doing is, what I mean by disconnected is they already aren't going to, say, supermarkets buying imported Western products. Their rubles are being spent on already domestically produced goods. After 2014, what the Russian economy did brilliantly is they're not totally sanctions proof, but they made themselves much more sanctions resilient by developing homegrown Russian industries, which didn't exist before, where you go to a Russian supermarket, and I was expecting to see like empty shelves. There's no more, French cheese coming into the country. No, there are plenty of supermarkets. My most recent visit to Russia was last summer, and at that time, at least, the supermarkets were brimming with all sorts of products. Putin would argue that actually your sanctions helped us to develop our economy. And in 2020, the year where the economy was cratering, Russia's economy grew 4.5%, which is, the U.S. Wished it had such growth in 2020. But what I'm saying is, the Russians have, to a certain extent, made their economy resilient. Here's where it's going to get tricky. They have a hoard of dollars and gold. Their central bank, between everything, I think in reserves, it's $630 billion. Maybe you know the figure better than I do. $630 billion of reserves. But at a certain point, you have to dip into those reserves in order to protect your currency. Because right now, they can do it. Right now, the central bank can keep it protected. I gather that they are doing that too. A lot of banks in Russia, the latest one being the Tinkoff Bank, it's called, have been basically saying to their depositors, don't worry, we have your back. They say, "Don't worry, we have your back."
We have
meaning
something in your
we're,
back.
we're buffered. I think that the central bank, they're all right now. They have their buffer there for the time being. The question is how much patience, how much tolerance how long will these sanctions remain? Will they grow in intensity, or will they sort of taper off? Will the West make the mistake of saying, "Oh, they seem to be getting better. He's not attacking Kiev as badly as we thought. Well, okay, we'll let them back in this system here. We'll let them back in here." But no, I'm a sanctions pessimist. I don't think that this is going to bring Putin down. There's no way, no amount of sanctions pain, nothing will make.
Right now, Berlin is key to this because you have to wait until the Germans and others who are so totally dependent on Russian gas decide that, okay, we'll accept to completely close the spigot.
Except how long will Europe be able to bear that? How long will Europe actually be?
I totally agree.
That's
what for the Russians.
They're counting on that.
They're counting on that sort of disarray. I don't think they found the West to be as much in disarray. And I totally buy into the argument that Bolton and others have made that the reason why Putin waited Trump out, during the 4 years of his presidency before doing anything in Ukraine was he was hoping that second term Trump was going to take the United States out of NATO, and that NATO would basically
that's
not be a
plausible.
factor.
That's plausible.
I think that at a minimum, the Russians can always get back into the Soviet playbook and say, okay, cut off. We are not, we cannot and will not be dependent on foreign exchange reserves and other non-ruble currencies.
Well, they'll turn to China, which
and
they're trying to do. But I'm only butting in because the turning to China argument, you can short circuit that because I actually don't think Xi Jinping, as much as he wants to use this, the U.S. is his greatest adversary right now, and he's buddying up with Putin in this front against the U.S., he has no love lost for Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping. And I think Russia is a pipsqueak compared to China, and China also has many bigger interests and other interests besides Russia. For now, it serves its
I
interests.
don't buy into the China-Russia alliance, but what I think makes sense is that eventually China, and Russia part ways, but Russia's still hunting down. And I think, like you, I'm a sanctions pessimist. I think we underestimate, as we always underestimate countries in these positions which are under sanctions, their capacity to resist when their leaders feel that they have to hold out and they have a significant amount of popular support, which in Russia will always largely support the regime, because among the things that you mentioned, they do remember the 1990s when they the myth is that Russia was weak, Russia was unstable, Russia was crime-ridden, and Russia was being pushed around by the West, and now we've got a leader who's standing up, and so they will fall in line if that's what. Unless
there is a limit to that narrative, because fine, they were pumped up on the patriotism, Putin restoring sort of the luster of a lost era a little bit, making Russia great again. But
we're years away towards that realization.
I agree with that. I agree with that.
Isn't the whole reason for the sanctions is because of this '94 agreement? The three countries who made Ukraine relinquish all of their nuclear power to Russia, and now the agreement was that no one would then attack Ukraine, and they would be protected. And now they're not. So why do we sanction?
Now who's not? Now you said now they're not.
Ukraine isn't protected in any way. The only way we protect.
Well, they're not a NATO member. That's true.
Idiotic sanctions that aren't having an effect, really, and you're proving that. So why can't we do something else? We, the world community, who's against Russia in this case.
I'm open to all ideas.
The 91 treaty was not a collective
I thought it was '94.
94, the boot.
The 94 treaty was not a collective.
It was a Budapest.
It was not something that was backed up by, if you cross the line, Russia, or if anybody else infringes upon Ukraine's
That's true,
sovereignty,
yeah.
there would be military or other consequences. It was mostly an effort, if I'm not mistaken, to allow Ukraine, like other former Soviet republics, to gain independence, and for Russia to recognize
it.
that
Yeah.
But the only way they could was to relinquish their nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And that weakened them and strengthened Russia, but three countries agreed to it.
Yeah, but
three
Washington
powers.
had no interest in having an independent country with yet another country with nuclear weapons, because who could say in 1994 what direction Ukraine was going to go.
That's true.
You know, I mean,
Very true,
But then
yeah.
why did they have the agreement in the first place? If they decided that Ukraine shouldn't have those nuclear weapons, they must have felt there was some power in their hands. That Britain,
well,
the U.S., and
Yeah.
Russia.
Okay, we're focusing on Ukraine. There was also Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, other countries. I think Belarus had
Belarus had.
nuclear weapons.
They did.
We wanted to make sure that the Soviets recaptured or recovered all of the nuclear weapons that they had forward deployed in the former Warsaw Pact countries.
They were scared about some of those weapons falling into the wrong hands, understandably. It was chaos.
It was always about
It was, yeah.
Russian generals, ex-Soviet generals somehow acquiring these weapons, selling
Yeah.
them to terrorists. I mean,
Get them into one place and get them into a safe place. Yeah.
a major theme.
Boy, we don't know how to function at all, do we?
But what I'm saying, it's not this is not a manichaean. This is not black and white choice here. You know, one path is the right path, and why aren't we doing this, and why didn't we do this? I think there's a million nuances in this, and this is what makes it so frustrating. I think right now for so many people trying to report on this story and figure out, untie this Gordian knot of inside Putin's mind. His frustrations. I mean, I have no doubt that his frustrations, as I said, are deep rooted, and a lot of Russians, like I said, because they grew up with that narrative, share his frustrations. There really is. I mean, the thing that you viscerally feel when you're in Russia is this sense of a victimization complex. They really do feel like they have been humiliated and belittled. And the thing is, it's not easy to respond to that because I don't think, as an American at least, we've never really been through that historical experience of, I don't know about you, I was like brought up in school, we were the mightiest, greatest military power. I never had to go through an historical rupture in my life where all of a sudden we went from that to being this sort of basket case country that just fell apart overnight and broke up into all these republics. So I can get where it's coming from. I can get where that visceral angst and rage. I just think it's unfortunate that at that moment you happen to get Yeltsin picking this KGB guy, putting him into power, the one guy who sees it as his historic legacy, his historic mission before he dies, and he's 69 now, or opportunity, to leave the world, to get Russia back, to bring back, Russia. They say, why does Trump admire Putin? Trump would have loved to have Putin's power. Trump, I mean, he admired the power that he had, the hold over his people. He really was able to do whatever it's nice to be king. It's like he could do whatever he wanted. And that's when I think that Putin was effective, at least through a lot of his tenure, in giving back to a lot of Russians that source of they were players again on the world stage. People now looked at them again. And in the case of the middle class, especially in the big cities, he created, he basically told the oligarchs to shut up, stay out of politics, but he made a whole class rich, and he made a whole middle class, gave them all the creature comforts of life. All these Russians who live basically Western European lifestyles in cities, you go visit them, you'd have no idea there's zero difference in their lifestyles until now. Than you'd have in London or Paris. In some cases, it's even better, I would say. And that is something. But they stay out of politics, a lot of them. That was the deal. That was the deal until now.
When you said about Putin believing his own rhetoric or whatever, I think of O.J. still thinks he's innocent.
Yeah.
There's a whole, there's a whole.
Does he? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Does he? Yeah, maybe he does.
So,
Not my talk.
this is slightly off topic, but
Yeah.
if he is trying to expand, the question that's been in the news a lot is he going to start going for Latvia and Estonia? and
No,
other
this is the
places?
other question.
I mean, is he going to expand into some of the other parts that, whether they were part of the Soviet Union, were part of the Eastern Bloc?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I mean, is Putin going to not just stop at Ukraine, but is he perhaps has his ambitions to expand into other areas beyond Ukraine, Latvia, the Baltic area? I guess you could even go beyond that. I mean, I use the same sort of answer that I would use with the nuclear weapons. Because I was on set. Full disclosure, I was on our set a few weeks ago, basically trying to convince our viewers that Putin wouldn't invade Ukraine. No, but what I mean is I wasn't wrong. I was wrong that he wouldn't invade all of Ukraine. I did think there was a very strong likelihood, not likelihood, I essentially said he's going to want Eastern Ukraine. We could write that off. He wants Eastern Ukraine. So goodbye Donbass, unfortunately. I thought Kiev at the time, I thought what he would want to do is keep it maybe at best divide it, keep it really weak and divided, maybe put a puppet regime in, not through use of troops, but to find some way to divide it in a way that Zelensky would fall without having to send in troops. So essentially he'd also have central Ukraine under Russian influence, even if he wasn't militarily controlling it, and they could still maybe call it Ukraine. And then he'd say, well, and Western Ukraine with Lviv and everything, he'd say, they're culturally different. They're basically the West. They're almost in Poland anyway. Let them do what they want. So I sort of had this in my own head. I had this scenario, this schema of this Eastern Putinian realm, Putin land, middle, muddled sort of Ukraine, semi-Ukraine, not really Ukraine, but Ukraine, and then the West still Ukraine. So I was wrong on that. So, which goes back to that question. So I don't know. I think Putin, I think the smart money now is never giving Putin the benefit of the doubt, like on anything. So if I were betting right now, I'd say, of course he would like to go further. And everyone says, all of these rational, analytical arguments where I've tried to stand there and say, well, consider it this way, because NATO has 30 members and they have these weapons, and he knows that if he does this. No, I don't think he's thinking that way anymore. I really do think this is why I call him madly rational, because his brain's functioning. He can, obviously he's lucid, he thinks and all of that, but I think it's all working within a warped world view. I think he would love to go further. I think he'd love to go into Moldova and Georgia. I really think he would like to do that. I think, we already know he wants Georgia to forswear ever becoming a NATO member, as Ukraine. That's one of their main red line conditions. If he could, he will. If he could, he will. Which is, so how do you stop him? I don't know.
I also wonder whether, I just hate to say this, but I wonder whether members of NATO are really going to say, okay, we're entering World War III to defend Latvia or something like that.
Listen.
Just as I don't know whether we're going to do that with Taiwan.
Listen, I interviewed the other day on our air Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, and I put this question to him. I said, what the hell do you? What do you do? I said, what do you do? Sweden and Finland say they now want to join NATO because they don't trust what Putin's going to do next and everything. What makes you think that he's actually going to stop at those, at the Ukrainian lines? And the answer, the answer is always with him. It's like a very wooden answer. He can't really go off script a little bit. But he's like, NATO is, ready to defend every inch of its territory. We are, we are moving and mobilizing troops to our eastern flank. To those members, we are determined and committed to their protection. I asked him about a no-fly zone. I said, well, you heard Zelensky calling for the no-fly zone. So there is no chance of that. He says, as of now, a no-fly zone is an exclusion zone, meaning basically enforcing no Russian planes would be allowed in Ukrainian airspace. Well, that means that you'd have to keep Russian planes out of Ukrainian airspace. So who does that? Well, it has to be someone else's combat planes, either Ukrainian or NATO combat planes. So no, it's off the table. Because, the problem Ukrainians don't know how to fly the Western jets, so now they're talking about maybe shipping Polish MiG-20, Soviet-era MiG-29s to Ukraine from Poland, and then the U.S. would replace them with what, F-16s or something? So Poland.
Did you see the Trump proposal to put Chinese insignias on the airplanes, and that way we can blame the Chinese?
That's a great, But well, you never know with.
I have a question.
Yeah, no, but so I think he would if he could. Maybe he will or he won't. I don't know. It's a muddle. There's a muddle. Yes, he could. He could. There's nothing really in Putin's mind stopping him. I still think Putin, despite everything, just to finish this, I still think Putin sees the West, this has always been part of his narrative, as weak and decadent and immoral, and give it enough time, play the clock, the West will break down. It will, yes, great, NATO's all united now. They're all together, marching shoulder to shoulder. But, don't worry. The West, we play the long game. Russia will ultimately, they're nothing against the determination of Russia and our lost empire.
Have we
So,
given planes to Ukraine?
Yes, I'm sorry.
My question is, since you're in your title, you're talking about disinformation.
Yeah.
What do you feel about using disinformation to fight disinformation to, like hackers are now doing?
They try.
should we put Chinese decals on planes? Should we do all of that? Is it a good strategy? Is it a long strategy?
Yeah, well, first of all,
Let me add to that. There was a Washington Post
Yeah.
article you may have seen talking about Ukrainians using basically Russian POWs,
Yes.
images of Russian soldiers as propaganda to feed back to Russians, often using direct telephone lines, having
calling their mothers.
So we
Saying-
know we know they're using it, but my question is, what should we do? Should we use more of it?
I want to make the point that the Post said that this is illegal under the rules of war. So
Disinformation, what, in order to, well, the rules.
to exploit war dead and POWs as for your purposes. So
It's really interesting because, first of all, the question I would have even beyond that is, even if they were to use that disinformation, how effective would it be? Because I mean, the firewalls that the Russians are putting up, yes, some stuff gets through, but most of it really isn't getting through. And like I said, the prejudice in Russia is so much against any disinformation that they feed them, they're inclined to disbelieve anyway. So in other words, when the Ukrainians have been showing these videos, and it's literally of the captured Russian soldiers, right, saying, "Hi, Mom, I've been captured by these troops. By the way, they're not Nazis, and they've given me some soup." And a phone to call you.
But it's a long game. It doesn't necessarily. We're not necessarily going to win in this war with disinformation.
Yeah.
But it is just like you said, the Soviets used propaganda, just like the Egyptians did, just like everybody.
Just like CIA and everyone.
CIA.
Yeah, everyone.
It's a long
yeah,
game, and it's a weapon, just like a gun.
It is a and there's the EU has a disinformation. Well, it's not a they don't call it a disinformation unit. They use a different label. They have a unit. I have a friend who works for it. There's a unit within the European Union that is basically set up to fight Russian disinformation, but it's not their it's different than what you're saying, because their way of fighting the disinformation, and I think it's less effective, is by putting out verified fact-checked information, saying the Russians say this, here's the disproof to this, but you're actually saying that they should play the Russians at their own game. It's a slippery slope. And by the way, I'm sure it's all going on, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
so are fighting guns with guns and nuclear weapons with nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
It's a slippery slope. It's
Yeah.
just, are we gonna do
but
it or not?
it's.
What happened to Voice of America?
It's still broadcasting, but it's right now not being picked up. At least in most of the Russian cities where I have friends, they're not able to listen to it. They're trying to use shortwave again, like the BBC. The BBC is now broadcasting on shortwave again in Russia. So we're going back in time so that the Russians have access to it. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which was also all throughout the Cold War, through thick and thin, they broadcast everywhere. They're gone. I mean, they're off the air now in the bandwidth in Russia. Really hard to break through that carapace. I don't know. I mean, everything is a tone of desperation in my voice, because I really don't know how to crack that information puzzle right now. When I go there, I'm just like the misinformed. If I try to speak to my Russian friends now, even the one whose families, the older parents or grandparents trust me, they know me, they still think that I'm the one who's being fed propaganda. They're like, well, that's what your media is showing you. And it just doesn't work to say, except our media is right now, or much more right than yours. That doesn't work. That argument, forget it. Doesn't work.
I have a personal question for you about your job. Do you ever have pause when somebody asks you, your company, asks you to do something, and you know that you're going into harm's way? Have you ever had a little second thought about that, or
About going into harm's way?
yes?
I had it 2 weeks ago. I was asked to go to Kiev, and I'm not in Kiev. No, but to seriously answer your question, first of all, I'm not a war reporter. Right. And there are a lot of journalists who, that's what they live for. They live and die to be war reporters. That is the reporting that they love. And, you just have to recognize what type of reporter you are. I have reported from war zones before, but I do believe that it's absolutely a vital mission to do, but at France 24, in order to be deployed right now to a war zone, you actually have to have, updated all the time, war training. It's a special war courses. Now, I had war training when I worked at CNN in London many years ago, it was with former SAS soldiers. They take you for a week and like kidnap you and make you crawl through minefields and stuff. I got killed 3 times. I was an awful, I was the worst war reporter. But I talked too much to my kidnappers and they shot me. They wanted me to shut up. You talk too much, they shot me. So no, but no, I'm making light of a very serious subject. It's, no, yes. A lot of people I work with, for that very reason, they don't think that they have the temperament or maybe even the instincts to be a very good war reporter. It's a certain type of temperament. You have to be a certain type of person to be a good war reporter. And I think part of it as a journalist is knowing sort of what you do best. You know what? So yes, I've been in those situations. They're really hairy. I've hated them. I was briefly taken hostage in Lugansk People's Republic for like half an hour. It wasn't that long. People have suffered far worse fates, but it was one of the scariest experiences of my life. You see everything flash before you. And I, and I don't relish being put in that position again. So we do continue to send people to those zones. We have a reporter right now reporting today from Irpin in Ukraine, which is under shelling, or was yesterday. We have a reporter who's in Kiev, same reporter actually. We have a reporter in Lviv, which for now is, fortunately for now, seems to be okay, just lots of refugees. But no, to answer your question, I'm not a war reporter. I personally do not like going into war zones. But yes, I believe it's an extremely important mission, and I admire greatly those who take it upon themselves to do that. But it's a very difficult job because it's not like about adrenaline rush. It's not about thrill seeking. It's not an extreme sport. It's a dangerous job where you have to follow very careful guidelines and rules to be able to get information out, to get as close to the fighting as you can without literally putting your life at risk and getting shot at. You saw probably the coverage of the Sky News crew. British Sky News came under fire from a Russian ambush in recent days, a few days ago, over the weekend, and it was horrible. I mean, they all survived, some with some injuries, but they really got out by the skin of their teeth by jumping off in an embankment 40 feet down, and they got away from the ambush. But they were in their car and they were shooting at the engines and the doors and they luckily they had their flak jackets on and their bulletproof vests and their helmets and all of that. But it is not a fun job, and it's not fun being live on air when you're in situations where all of a sudden a place that was peaceful 10 minutes before all of a sudden becomes a war zone. We've literally been in situations where you're reporting from, you set up your camera in an area, you say, it's quiet here, this is cool, this is fine. And while you're going to air, while you're on air, all of a sudden it changes. I mean, any military person, I guess, will tell you that the terrain in the battlefield, that's why you need real-time information in a battlefield, because the actual lay of the land on a military battlefield changes in the blink of an eye. What was peaceful a minute ago, all of a sudden is a very here and now danger to your life. Get out of there. So.
Chris Hedges talked about the journalists who were war junkies, though. That
Yeah.
It is an adrenaline rush.
It gets to be,
but
but.
can't let go of it.
Yeah, but we have a whole bunch of people in my channel who did it for years and years and years. They're like that, they're like that. They drank so much coffee and they're just like bundle of nerves. And at a certain point, you just have to withdraw from it. I mean, unless you just have nerves of steel, it really can rattle you. I mean, it's just, I don't care who you are. It's really, really, it's scary. It's scary. There's no other, it's not a matter of bravery when you're surrounded by artillery fire.
And that microphone.
Yeah, I mean, and even with the best war training, you're taught how to recognize certain shells. So you're taught to, if you hear this type of whistle, or if you hear this fire, what type of shell is that likely to be? How close is it? Is that heavy artillery? How close to you is that likely to land? Is that an immediate threat to you? Are you safe in this position? Those are the types of things they teach you, but whatever. I'm not a war ammunition expert. So with my little training, I could distinguish between, mortar fire, heavy artillery, sure, stuff like that. But, and I might be able to know if it's a Ukrainian or a Russian jet, if I could see the markings on it, but who the hell knows? You could also paint the jet to fool people. That's the disinformation too, So no, I mean, it's a horribly scary job, and even the best of war reporters can be killed at any moment, and it happens quite frequently, unfortunately. And the flip side of that question is, so how the hell do you have any credibility, you sitting here talking about Russia and Ukraine, if you're not there in the war zone right now? And I don't buy into that argument either. There are so many ways right now, in today's age especially, where you can get information about what's going on in a war zone. Nothing obviously substitutes for being the eyes and ears on the ground. I acknowledge that, but that doesn't mean that you're just a misinformed idiot if you're not right there taking the bullets in the war zone. You know, that's how I see it. Anyone else?
I have a couple of questions that are a little divergent from what we've been saying, but they're generally same topic. The artists who have lost their positions, the Russian artists like the opera singers, who try to draw a line, as I understand it, between supporting Putin but not supporting the war. As a commentary, I'm curious your view as to whether that's a legitimate division to raise at a point where there's such dramatic actions. Can you really say, well, I support Putin, but I don't support this war?
Yeah.
It doesn't even matter. It's really the follow-up. Do you think is it fair for someone to be fired because they have a view? And is there more to these stories that we don't know? These are Putin's friends.
There's more to the stories that we don't know. My reaction is really easy for me to sit here in my armchair. Actually, there are no arms on this chair. For me to sit here in my armless chair and to pass moral judgment on, you know, someone in a Russian cultural sphere because they didn't take a position again. How dare you? You know, here I am sitting in a cafe in Paris passing moral judgment on them. The reality is, as you know, life and people are a lot more complicated than that. And there are any number of reasons where people might not get out there at the barricades and start protesting and hold up the no to war, Нет войне signs. You know, million reasons. So my personal answer to your question is, no, I do not hold it against those people. I understand, having lived in Russia, that lives are complicated. So much of your life is structured around being able to do things, have access to education, to jobs, to universities, around playing along, going along with it. So a lot of people are politically apathetic, but they're not politically active. They're not activists. Example, my wife and her best friend, who's now in Paris. We were watching the protests on television, and they said to us, oh my God, those are such brave people. I wish we could do that, but we can't. I'm not brave enough. I can't. I have too much at stake. My family has this position. So much of your life is tied up in things. You know, if you could lose your job, for instance, in Russia, if you are working, say, in the state sector or for a government ministry, and you don't go to vote. You don't go to show up to vote. You have to show up to vote. And presumably you're going to vote for Putin. So if you work, not in the private sector, it's harder to monitor you in the private sector, but I'm sure that's coming. But if you work for, say, the education ministry, and it's voting day in Russia, your boss says, okay, so you're going to be, you know, and you're going to also be going to protest. They try to get you out to protest. So the workplace is going to be going protesting today. It's built into your mindset. Activism, unless you're in a rarefied elite of savvy young people who are also, yes, very brave and very daring and very motivated and energetic. It's not right now the natural impulse right now in Russia. That could change. If things get bad enough, sure, the tide could change. Could happen over time, who knows? But no, for most people, I think so many other factors and calculations go into it. So no, I'm not going to judge that person necessarily. I do judge people in the West who have the luxury of free expression and protest and decide to support Putin, like Gérard Depardieu. But that's another story, you know?
You're talking specifically about Anna Netrebko and the Met. She's been vocally supportive of Putin.
Yeah.
Vocally. And I don't know her story. I don't know if she has family in the USSR. I mean, that's not the USSR, because it is.
No.
Going back to the USSR. In Russia. But she has had an opportunity to take this passive, say nothing role, but she's doing the opposite. I was also
interesting.
horrified that the Met took this stance because I thought, oh, now art is going to penalize the artists because they're Russian. And so I was mortified. I actually thought the Met did the wrong thing until I did the research. And I realized that she was doing some things that were an embarrassment for the Met, and they had to make a move. But that's the thing. I mean, when I was a kid, you know, what's his face defected?
Baryshnikov, yeah.
Like, this isn't the case anymore because they've had the luxury of having a quasi-diplomatic Russia where everyone could do their thing and they had access to information.
Yeah.
This is an unfortunate situation. Russia, by the way, the Russians own the Met right now. I don't mean Russia, but I mean the culture there is a lot of Russian stars, Russian directors, Russian producers, and Russian composers have overtaken the Met. So it's a really interesting time.
It's an ethical debate.
It's a huge political
and what about the
debate.
the London Royal Opera, I believe, right? Their director Sorokin, I believe, was fired. He's Russian, and they said we cannot at this time. What am I making that up or no? Is that fake? Is that fake news? Yeah. So yes, he was no, because there's so many names flying around in my head.
Trump tried to get out the news about opera.
There is also an easy cancel culture at play that allows this kind of movement to happen, whether they marry it or not. So to your point, she deserved it, in my opinion, and I'm not a fan of her anyway, so I'm like, get her out. What's the line here? But they're also not saying I defect, I want asylum, I'm on your side. So it's a tricky time. To your point, it's not like
there's some, I guess, obvious cases where you could maybe pass judgment on someone, but it really is on a case-by-case basis, and you have to know their circumstances. You have to know what are their motivations. What is, everyone is very different, and you have to know what their life experience is, and what are all the variables in their life experience, right? I mean, who the hell knows? If I were there and I were brought up in this regime, and I had like a nice cushy job in the cultural sphere, and I knew that the only thing I had to do is keep my mouth shut if I wanted to be able to keep supporting my family and have a livelihood. I don't have to go out and maybe vocally support Putin, but just not say anything. Who the hell knows?
I know, I wouldn't want to be in the
there's that French singer who, if I was born in, si j'étais né en 17 en Leidenstadt, it's like he's saying if I were born in 1917 in Leidenstadt, in this town, what would I have done if I had been on the front line? Would I have had the conscience to speak out? I mean, we had the luxury of being able to actually ask these questions and well, I would do this. I don't know what I'd do. I'd like to know. That's not true. I would like to think that I would be one of those people protesting on the streets of Moscow. But who the hell knows? I might just be hunkered down in my apartment in Moscow saying, who are those lunatics on the street? Who knows?
Well, it does raise, all this sort of raises an additional question, which is about the Russian communities sprinkled around the world, and especially here in Europe.
Here in Europe,
where they're numerous. I mean, I have seen images, for example, of protesters in London holding up signs that say, I am Russian, but I do not support this war, and Putin is my enemy too.
Yeah.
And it's really quite arresting to see some of this, because the look on the people's faces is a real crisis. We talk about identity and sort of being torn literally between where they're living now and how they feel, possibly because they've encountered conditions now in a way that has undone some of the conditioning from when they were living in Russia. But I can't believe that all these people who are having their yachts confiscated and their housing confiscated in Nice and elsewhere are necessarily, rah-rah Putin, rah-rah, campaign in Ukraine.
But that was like us under Trump.
Well, I don't know. If we had moved into Mexico, maybe.
Well,
but the point is, I think that one of the questions I have is whether organizations like yours are going to be paying more attention to this over the coming weeks and months, because that's a story.
You're right.
As you have large numbers of Russians as they can get out, taking whatever train, bus into Finland, using whatever route they can to join these communities.
Well, relative to having courage, like your wife and a friend, to protest, I watched a documentary the other night on Netflix called Winter Fire.
Okay,
and it's about it's a terrific documentary about the Ukrainian people who stood up against their government in November of 2013, I think 3 months or whatever. I cried, it inspired me. I was so amazed by the courage of these people.
It's true,
They took to the street and they took back their government. I mean,
it is amazing.
If you get Netflix and you get it, watch it. It's really worth it.
You're right about that. And the Ukrainians, I literally have to say, the Russians really picked the wrong adversary. Because, I mean, they are, as a people generally, if you're going to make a broad, sweeping generalization, amazingly courageous. And on all levels, it's just, you could say, okay, there are a lot of people fleeing, but there are a lot of people, yes, with families and young kids who want to get out of the country. But for everyone fleeing, there are 10 people who are staying and really, really standing up and doing things at the risk of their life. that sense. And this is where like that whole question of the Russian troops being demoralized comes into play, because like I said, a lot of them, this is where the propaganda is all of a sudden, maybe there's a dent in the armor because they get there, these Russian troops. And if you are to believe a lot of these videos being released by the Ukrainians, a lot of the interviews that they're doing with Russian troops are, we had no idea where we were going, what we were doing, what our mission was. We really did think that we were going to be welcomed as heroes and liberators, and these people, wow, it's being confronted with this completely alternate reality to what you were told or what you were lied to about by your commanders and generals, these young conscripts, right? So it's really, although Putin officially says there are no conscripts going to Ukraine, but yeah.
Is it in World War I where Christmas time the opposing armies lay down their guns? And
yeah.
Why don't they just lay down their guns and quit forever? Is what I keep imagining.
That'd be nice. Yeah.
I'm curious to know your thoughts about how, if you think the Putin regime at the moment and the propaganda that you spoke about, whether it's having an effect on Western countries here in the rest of Europe and around the world. And secondly, based on since Monday, we've had 12 official candidates for the French presidential election, and I estimate, based on my readings, at least half of them have supported Putin in one way or another.
Yep.
And that's going to have a big effect on the French presidential election.
You're absolutely right.
Here in France.
Yeah.
How do you think those two effects are going to have an impact?
I'll quickly, I think you're standing up because we're, No, let me just answer that. Yeah, if you're okay, I can. Let me attack with the French thing first. You're absolutely right. So of the 12 candidates, 3 are either Trotskyists or communists, and 3 are far right. And then the rest are like mainstream or center right. And you're right. So like Mélenchon is non-aligned, right? Basically you don't support. We should not support either Ukrainians or Putin. We're non-aligned, and right. It's like Switzerland here, but even Switzerland's changing its colors. I think that this is I think with the presidential race here, Macron's approval ratings have actually gone up during this war. If you've seen the latest polls, just before the invasion, he was like at about 25-26%. Now he's at 29-30%, and he's inching up every day. And I think a lot of this is because they see there used to be a lot of anger at him for going. I remember when he'd go buddy with Trump and negotiating with Trump, and I remember I went to these summits and we'd ask him, "Why are you talking to Trump? No one's and he'd say, "I'm the president of France. He's the president of America. It doesn't matter what I think about him personally. I have an obligation to talk to the president of the United States. We have other things, we have problems to solve, we have things to work on." And he's had the same approach to Putin, and I think that there's a logic in it, because I'm not saying Macron has been able to stay Putin's hand. If there's any takeaway from my talk, it seems that nothing can stay Putin's hand. But I do think that just being there, being the last man standing at that negotiating desk, at that table there, maybe is having the slightest influence, even if it's just buying a little bit of time to figure things out. But I do, your question, going back to the first part of the question, which was just to
how do you think Putin and his regime have been successful in their dissemination to impact Western populations?
Yeah, there's a lot. Well, no. Well, there's a lot. Hold on. Well, let's look at the United States, close to all of us. The Congress, the Republican Party especially, is right now divided, sorely divided over what stance to take. With a lot of people falling, the Trumpers are falling into line with Trump on, backing Putin, admiring Putin. It's the way forward and all of that. There are a lot of people, especially, and these are people I would maintain, they haven't lived in Russia. They don't know the reality of Russia. They don't really know Russian culture or history that well. They're just blindly following, their gut instincts here, the rah gut instincts. They think what Putin's doing is a sign of strength, that the West is paying its comeuppance, the rightful price for what it is inflicted on Russia all these years. Putin is only doing what any patriot would do. It is having an impact on Western opinion, and not just in the U.S., here in Europe too. Yes, there's large elements of the far right and the not so far right here in Europe, which are, if not pro-Putin, at least sympathetic to his cause. Yeah.
What is his cause?
Yeah. Well. So.
We
Water
could
soil.
probably talk about this for quite a while longer, especially with Douglas. But it's not, I just want to say thank you. And I
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, love you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Yeah.
So much to everyone who came, and to Douglas Herbert for being here, which is quite an honor. And don't forget to pay for your drink. I have to say that. And you're welcome to stay as long as you like.
Great.
You were mentioning